The sound of sirens still makes my hands shake. That Tuesday evening, I was folding laundry when the wailing cut through our quiet neighborhood. I dropped the towels and ran outside, my slippers slapping against the pavement. The ambulance was parked in my son Drew's driveway, red lights painting everything the color of panic. My 8-year-old grandson Trip lay on a stretcher, conscious but crying. His bike was crumpled against the garage door, one wheel still spinning slowly. Drew stood beside the ambulance, his face white as paper. When he saw me running toward them, something dark flashed across his expression. "Where were you?" he shouted before I could even ask what happened. "You were supposed to watch him." I opened my mouth to explain that Trip had left my house 30 minutes earlier, that I'd watched him ride safely down the street toward home. But the paramedic was asking questions, and Drew was climbing into the ambulance, and my daughter-in-law, Roberto, couldn't look at me. As the ambulance pulled away, I noticed something odd. Fresh scrape marks ran along the side of Drew's SUV, and there was a small dent in the rear bumper that hadn't been there that morning. The hospital waiting room felt like a courtroom where I'd already been convicted. Drew paced the hallway, talking on his phone in hushed, angry tones. Every few minutes, he'd glance at me with eyes full of blame. Roberto sat in the corner, staring at her hands. "The doctor says his leg is broken in 2 places," Drew announced when he finally hung up. "They need to do surgery." My heart cracked. "Can I see him?" "I think you've done enough," Drew said, his voice cold as winter. I tried to piece together what had happened. Trip had spent the afternoon at my house, helping me bake cookies for the church fundraiser. He'd left around 5:30, promising to be home before dark. It was barely 6 when the sirens started. "Drew, I need you to know," I began. "I need you to leave," he interrupted. "Just go home, Mom." As I walked to my car, I heard Roberto on the phone behind me. Yes, it was his grandmother's fault, she was saying. She kept him too late, and he was rushing home in the dark. But it wasn't dark. The sun had still been shining when Trip left my house. The whispers started at church that Sunday. I felt them before I heard them, like a chill running down my spine during the opening hymn. Mrs. Henley, who usually saved me a seat, was suddenly very interested in her bulletin. The pastor's wife gave me a sad, pitying smile that made my stomach turn. After service, I overheard Betty Green talking to a group of women near the fellowship hall. "Poor little Trip," she was saying, shaking her gray head. "If only his grandmother had been more responsible." I wanted to defend myself, to tell them Trip had left my house safely, but doubt crept in like fog. Had I been too distracted? Should I have driven him home instead of letting him ride his bike? The questions twisted in my mind until I started believing maybe it really was my fault. Drew didn't return my calls. When I drove by their house, the curtains were always drawn. I left casseroles on their doorstep, but they were never touched. By the end of the week, the story had solidified into something harder than concrete. Grandma kept him too late. Grandma wasn't watching carefully enough. Grandma caused the accident. The first hospital bill arrived addressed to me. $23,000 for emergency surgery and a 3-day stay. I stared at the numbers until they blurred, then called Drew. "We think it's only fair," he said, his tone matter of fact, "since your negligence caused this." I wanted to argue, but guilt had wrapped itself around my throat like a scarf. Maybe they were right. Maybe I deserved to pay. I liquidated my savings account and wrote a check that cleaned out 40 years of careful budgeting. The bills kept coming: physical therapy, follow-up appointments, a special tutor when Trip fell behind in school because his leg wouldn't heal properly. Each envelope felt like a fresh accusation, and each payment felt like an admission of guilt. I sold my mother's china set, the one I'd planned to pass down to Trip someday. I sold my wedding ring and the antique furniture my late husband had inherited from his grandmother. Piece by piece, I dismantled my life to pay for a moment I still couldn't fully remember causing. Drew never said thank you. He never said the payments weren't necessary. He just deposited each check as if I owed him far more than money. 6 months after the accident, I finally got to see Trip. I was leaving the grocery store when I spotted him limping across the parking lot with Roberto. His leg was still in a brace, and he walked carefully, like each step hurt. "Trip," I called out, rushing toward him. He turned and his face lit up with the smile I'd missed so desperately. "Grandma?" He started toward me, but Roberto grabbed his arm. "We need to go," she said quickly, steering him away. "But it's Grandma," Tripp protested, looking confused. "Come on," Roberto insisted, pulling him toward their car. I followed them. "Please, I just want to hug him. I've missed him so much." Roberto finally turned to face me, and her expression was ice cold. "You've done enough damage, don't you think?" Tripp looked between us, his young face creased with confusion. "Why can't I see Grandma anymore?" he asked. "Because," Roberto said, opening the car door, "sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt people. Big mistakes." As they drove away, I saw Tripp's small face pressed against the rear window, watching me grow smaller in the distance. Year 2 brought more bills and deeper isolation. Tripp's leg wasn't healing correctly and needed another surgery. The doctor recommended a specialist 3 hours away, and suddenly I was paying for gas money and hotel stays for their trips. I took a part-time job at the library, shelving books for $12 an hour. My arthritis made the work painful, but I needed every penny. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, was kind enough not to ask why a 70-year-old woman suddenly needed employment. At night, I would drive past Drew's house and see the warm yellow light in the kitchen windows. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of my family eating dinner together, Tripp laughing at something Drew said. I'd park at the end of the street and watch them like a stranger, hungry for even this distant view of the life I'd lost. The hardest part wasn't the money or the loneliness. It was the growing certainty that something about their story didn't make sense. I kept replaying that evening, trying to remember if I'd really been careless. But every time I reached the moment when Tripp left my house, the memory was crystal clear. He was happy, safe, and riding carefully down the sidewalk in broad daylight. The 3rd year, Drew got a promotion, and they moved to a bigger house across town. I found out when Mrs. Henley mentioned it after church, assuming I already knew. They hadn't told me they were moving. They hadn't given me their new address. I drove around for hours until I found the house, a 2-story colonial with a perfect lawn and a swing set in the backyard. My grandson was playing outside with neighborhood kids, running and laughing. His limp was barely noticeable now, thank goodness, but seeing him from a distance felt like looking at a photograph of someone I used to know. I parked across the street and watched him play until Roberto came outside. Even from that distance, I could see her scan the street suspiciously. When her gaze landed on my car, she quickly called Tripp inside. That night, Drew called me for the first time in months. "Stay away from our house," he said without preamble. "You're scaring Roberto." "I just wanted to see how Tripp's doing," I whispered. "He's doing fine, no thanks to you. The therapist says he still has nightmares about the accident." The line went dead. I sat holding the phone until the dial tone became unbearable. By year 4, I'd paid over $60,000 in medical bills and related expenses. My small house felt cavernous and empty. The church ladies still whispered when they thought I couldn't hear, though their whispers had softened from outrage to pity. I started having dreams about that evening. In them, I would watch Tripp leave my house, see him pedal down the street, and then the scene would shift to something I'd never witnessed. Headlights, the screech of brakes, the awful thud of impact. I'd wake up gasping, unsure what was memory and what was guilt-driven imagination. One particularly bad night, I decided to drive past Drew's old house. I wasn't sure why, maybe hoping to find some clarity in the place where everything had gone wrong. The new owners had painted it blue and planted roses where Drew's scrape-marked SUV used to park. I was sitting in my car, staring at the driveway, when old Mr. Patterson from next door tapped on my window. I rolled it down, embarrassed to be caught. "You're Tripp's grandmother?" he said gently. "I remember you from before." I nodded, expecting another lecture about responsibility. Instead, he said something that made my blood run cold. I always wondered why they never asked me what I saw that night. Mr. Patterson invited me inside for coffee, and with shaking hands, I followed him into his tidy kitchen. He was 83 years old, sharp as a tack, and had lived next door to Drew's family for 15 years. "I was watering my tomatoes when it happened," he said, settling into his chair. "Saw the whole thing through my fence. My heart hammered against my ribs." "What did you see?" He sighed deeply. That SUV came backing out of the driveway fast. Too fast. The little boy was just riding up the sidewalk, minding his own business. She never saw him. Shoo. My voice came out as a whisper. The mother, Roberto, she was backing out in a hurry, talking on her phone, hit that boy clean off his bike. Mr. Patterson shook his head sadly. When I heard them later saying it was because you kept him too late, well, I knew that wasn't true. The coffee mug trembled in my hands. Why didn't you say anything? I tried. Called your son the next day, told him what I'd witnessed. He said the family needed privacy to heal, asked me not to spread rumors that would make things harder for everyone involved. I set down the mug before I dropped it. 5 years of guilt, shame, and financial ruin, all built on a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my small house, Mr. Patterson's words echoing in my mind. Roberto had hit Tripp with the SUV. She'd been backing out too fast, not paying attention, and my grandson had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But instead of owning the truth, they'd crafted a story that painted me as the villain. They'd let me pay for their mistake, watched me sell everything I owned, allowed the entire community to judge me for something I hadn't done. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just angry, furious. I'd spent 5 years believing I was a terrible grandmother who'd failed to protect her grandchild. I'd isolated myself, taken blame that wasn't mine, and funded their lie with my life savings. At 3 a.m, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth. All of it. I started by calling the police station. The officer on duty was polite but explained that accident reports from 5 years ago weren't something they typically discussed over the phone. I'd need to come in person with proper identification and fill out a request form. Is there an investigation still open? I asked. Ma'am, I can't discuss details, but if you're family, you have a right to see the report. The next morning, I dressed carefully and drove to the police station. The desk sergeant was a kind woman in her 40s who patiently explained the process for requesting old accident reports. It'll take a few days, she warned me. But you're listed as family, so there shouldn't be any problems. 3 days later, I sat in my kitchen with the official report spread across the table. My hands shook as I read the details, typed in official police language that made everything seem coldly factual. The accident had occurred at 6:15 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. The victim, Tripp Green Hayes, age 8, had been riding his bicycle on the sidewalk when he was struck by a reversing vehicle. The driver, Roberto Green Hayes, stated she had not seen the child approaching and had been distracted by a phone call. The report noted that the child had been wearing bright clothing and reflective safety gear. Visibility was good. The driver admitted to backing up perhaps too quickly and not checking the mirrors thoroughly. No charges were filed. The incident was ruled an accident caused by driver inattention. Not one word about grandmother negligence. Nothing about keeping him too late. Nothing about my supposed responsibility. I read the report 3 times, and each reading made me angrier. Armed with the truth, I drove to Drew's new house. My grandson was at school, which was probably for the best. This conversation needed to happen between adults. Roberto answered the door looking perfectly put together in yoga pants and a designer sweater. When she saw me, her expression shifted from surprise to irritation. "What do you want?" she asked, not inviting me in. I held up the police report. "I want to talk about what really happened that night." Her face went pale, but she quickly recovered. "I don't know what you mean." "You backed into him," I said simply. "You were on your phone, not paying attention, and you hit my grandson with your SUV. Then you blamed me." "That's ridiculous," she said, but her voice was shaky. "You kept him too late and he was rushing. He left my house at 5:30 in broad daylight, wearing reflective safety gear, just like he always did. You know this because the police report documents all of it." Roberto's hands were trembling now. She glanced over my shoulder as if checking to see if any neighbors were watching. "Even if that's true," she said quietly, "it was an accident. And you were happy to help with the bills. No one forced you." The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. "Happy to help?" I repeated, my voice rising. "I sold everything I owned because I thought I'd failed to protect my grandchild. I've lived with guilt and shame for 5 years, and you were happy to let me destroy myself over your lie?" Roberto stepped back, finally showing some genuine fear. Keep your voice down. The neighbors. The neighbors deserve to know the truth, don't you think? Look, Roberto said, her tone shifting to something that might have been pleading. What's done is done. Tripp's fine now. Why dig up old pain? Because I have a right to my own life back, I said firmly. Because my grandson deserves a grandmother who isn't carrying shame that belongs to someone else. And because lies have a way of poisoning everything they touch. I handed her a copy of the police report. I'm going to tell Drew tonight. You can be there for that conversation, or you can let him hear it from me alone. Your choice. Roberto stared at the papers in her hands as if they were a poisonous snake. What do you want? She whispered. I want the truth told to everyone who heard the lie. I want my relationship with my grandson back. And I want you to figure out how you're going to make up for 5 years of stolen money and stolen time. Drew came to my house that evening, looking haggard and confused. Roberto had obviously told him about our conversation, but I could see he was still processing the implications. Mom, he said, settling heavily into my kitchen chair, I need to understand what happened here. I placed the police report in front of him and watched his face as he read. The color drained from his cheeks, and his hands began to shake just as mine had. She told me you'd kept him too late, he said finally, his voice barely audible. She said he was rushing home in the dark because you hadn't been watching the time. He left my house at 5:30, Drew, in broad daylight, just like always. Drew covered his face with his hands. Oh God, oh my God, what have we done? You believed your wife instead of asking questions, I said gently but firmly. You let me pay $60,000 for her mistake. You cut me out of Tripp's life based on a lie. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear I didn't know she was lying. I wanted to comfort him. He was my son, and he was clearly devastated. But 5 years of pain and isolation had taught me the importance of truth over comfort. Drew, even if you believe the accident was my fault, did I deserve to lose my relationship with Tripp? Did I deserve to be treated like a criminal? Drew looked up at me with tears in his eyes, and for a moment he looked like the little boy I'd raised, the one who used to crawl into my lap when he was scared or hurt. No, he said simply. You didn't deserve any of it. I was so angry and scared when Tripp got hurt. I needed someone to blame, and when Roberto said it was your fault, it felt easier than accepting that accidents just happen sometimes. He stood up and began pacing my small kitchen. But Mom, $60,000? Why didn't you ever say you couldn't afford it? Why didn't you fight back? Because I believed you, I said. Because I trusted my own son when he told me I'd failed to protect his child. Because I thought taking care of the bills was the least I could do to make up for my carelessness. But you weren't careless. I know that now. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us grappling with the weight of the truth. Finally, Drew spoke again. What can I do to fix this? How do I make this right? First, you tell Tripp the truth. He's old enough to understand that adults sometimes make mistakes, and he deserves to know why his grandmother disappeared from his life. Drew nodded. Second, you and Roberto figure out how to pay me back. Not because I need the money, but because taking responsibility means making amends. He nodded again. And third, you help me tell the truth to everyone who heard the lie. The next Sunday, Drew asked Pastor Williams if he could make an announcement before the closing prayer. I sat in my usual back pew, my heart hammering as my son walked to the front of the church. 5 years ago, my son Tripp was hurt in a bicycle accident. Drew began, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. At that time, I wrongly blamed my mother for the accident, and many of you were kind enough to support our family during that difficult period. I could feel heads turning, whispers starting, but Drew continued. I recently learned that the accident was not my mother's fault. It was a tragic accident that occurred in our driveway when my wife accidentally backed into Tripp while he was riding his bike home. My mother had been a loving, careful guardian that day, just as she'd always been. The whispers grew louder. Mrs. Henley turned to stare at me with wide eyes. I let my mother carry blame and shame that belonged elsewhere, Drew said, his voice breaking slightly. I let her pay for our medical expenses when she was not at fault. I allowed her to be cut off from her grandson when she had done nothing wrong. He paused, wiping his eyes. I'm asking this community to forgive my terrible judgment and to welcome my mother back into the fellowship she never should have been excluded from. She is a good woman who deserves better than the treatment she received from her own family. After church, I was surrounded by people I hadn't spoken to in years. The response was mixed. Some approached with genuine apologies and warmth, while others seemed unsure how to process this reversal of a story they'd believed for so long. Mrs. Henley hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she kept saying. I should have asked more questions. I should have trusted my gut that you would never put Trip in danger. Betty Green, who had been one of the most vocal critics, approached more hesitantly. I don't know what to say, she admitted. I repeated that story to so many people. Then repeat this one, I said simply. Pastor Williams pulled me aside as the crowd thinned. Is there anything else the church can do to help make this right? He asked. I thought for a moment. The fundraiser you organized raised money based on false information. People donated because they believed I had caused Trip's accident through negligence. Maybe it's time to tell them the truth and let them decide what they want to do with that knowledge. He nodded gravely. I'll prepare something for the newsletter this week. As I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in 5 years. The truth was finally out, spreading through the community like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. That evening, Trip called me. It was the first time I'd heard his voice in over a year, and it made me cry before he even spoke. Grandma? His voice was tentative, unsure. Hi, sweetheart, I managed to say through my tears. Dad told me what really happened, he said quietly. He said Mom hit me with the car by accident, and then everyone thought it was your fault. But it wasn't. That's right, honey. There was a long pause. I missed you so much, Grandma. I kept asking why you didn't want to see me anymore, and they said grown-ups sometimes had to stay away when they made big mistakes. But you didn't make a mistake, did you? No, sweetheart. I didn't, and I missed you every single day. Can I come visit you? Like before? Can we bake cookies again? My heart felt like it might burst. Yes, Trip. Anytime you want. What about tomorrow? Tomorrow is perfect. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and cried, not tears of sadness this time, but tears of relief and joy. My grandson still loved me. Despite 5 years of separation, despite the lies he'd been told, his heart had held on to our connection. Trip's visit the next day was everything I'd dreamed about during the long years of separation. He was taller now, 13 years old, with his father's smile and his grandfather's curious eyes. The limp was completely gone, and he moved with the easy confidence of a teenager. We made chocolate chip cookies, his favorite, and he chattered about school, his friends, and the baseball team he'd joined. But eventually, the conversation turned to more serious matters. Why did Mom lie? He asked, while we waited for the cookies to bake. I chose my words carefully. People sometimes make mistakes, and then they make bigger mistakes, trying to cover up the first one. Your mom was scared and embarrassed, and she thought blaming someone else would be easier than telling the truth. But it hurt you. Yes, it did. But it hurt your whole family, really. Lies always do. Trip nodded thoughtfully. Are you mad at her? I considered this question seriously. I was very angry for a while, but anger is like carrying a heavy stone around. Eventually, you have to put it down, or it hurts you more than anyone else. So you forgive her? I'm working on it, I said honestly. Forgiveness isn't something that happens all at once, especially when the hurt was so deep. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life being angry. I want to spend it being happy with the people I love. He smiled and hugged me tight. I love you, Grandma. The following weeks brought a series of uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Roberto came to my house one afternoon, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. I don't know how to apologize for what I've done, she said, standing awkwardly in my living room. I know sorry isn't enough. I gestured for her to sit down. Despite everything, I couldn't enjoy seeing her suffer. Why didn't you just tell the truth from the beginning? I asked. She stared at her hands. I was terrified. I'd hurt my child, and I thought everyone would think I was a terrible mother. When Drew assumed it was your fault because Tripp had been at your house, it seemed like an escape. An escape that cost me $60,000 and 5 years with my grandson. I know. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I kept telling myself you could afford it, that you wanted to help, that it wasn't really hurting you. I convinced myself of so many lies that I almost believed them. Almost? She shook her head. No, not really. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I just didn't know how to stop once it started. It was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. I didn't forgive her in that moment, but I felt something shift, a tiny crack in the wall of resentment I'd built. What happens now? She asked. Now you figure out how to live with the truth, I said, and you start making amends. Drew and Roberto worked out a payment plan to reimburse the money I'd spent on Tripp's medical care. They insisted on paying interest, though I told them it wasn't necessary. The first check arrived with a note from Drew. This doesn't make up for the time we stole, but it's a start. More importantly, my relationship with Tripp flourished. He came over every weekend, and we picked up where we'd left off, baking, gardening, and talking about everything under the sun. He told me about the confusion and sadness he'd felt during our separation, and I told him stories about his grandfather and his father's childhood. The community response continued to evolve. Some people apologized sincerely and welcomed me back warmly. Others seemed uncomfortable with the reversal of the story they'd believed and maintained their distance. I realized I couldn't control everyone's reaction, and I didn't need to. Mrs. Foster at the library insisted I didn't need to keep working, but I found I enjoyed the job. It gave me purpose and allowed me to contribute to the community in a positive way. Plus, the extra income meant I could take Tripp on small adventures, trips to the zoo, the science museum, and ball games. One evening, Drew stopped by while Tripp and I were working on a jigsaw puzzle. I need to ask you something, he said, settling into the chair across from us. I looked up expectantly. How do you trust me again after what I did? It was a fair question and one I'd been grappling with myself. How do you rebuild a relationship with someone who caused you such deep pain? Trust has to be rebuilt slowly, I told Drew, while Tripp continued working on the puzzle, pretending not to listen. It's not something you can demand or expect immediately. You earn it back through consistent actions over time. Drew nodded, looking thoughtful. But Drew, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago. The woman who quietly accepted blame and paid those bills without question is gone. I learned to stand up for myself, to question stories that don't make sense, and to protect my own well-being. I respect that, he said quietly. Good, because it means our relationship going forward will be more honest. I won't pretend everything is fine when it isn't, and I won't sacrifice my own truth to keep peace. Tripp looked up from the puzzle. That sounds better anyway, Grandma. More real. Out of the mouths of babes, I thought, smiling at my wise grandson. Over the following months, Drew proved through his actions that he was committed to making amends. He included me in family decisions, invited me to school events, and never once questioned my judgment with Tripp. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild what had been broken. A year after the truth came out, Tripp's baseball team made it to the regional championship. As I sat in the bleachers, cheering for my grandson, I reflected on how much had changed. The financial reimbursement was almost complete, but more importantly, my relationships had been restored and strengthened. Tripp and I were closer than ever, bonded not just by love, but by the shared experience of surviving a difficult time. Drew had become a more thoughtful father and son, quicker to ask questions and slower to judge. Even Roberto seemed to be growing, attending therapy and working to understand how her fear had led to such destructive choices. As for me, I'd learned that truth is worth fighting for, even when it's uncomfortable. I'd learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending damage wasn't done. It means choosing not to let someone else's mistakes define your future. Tripp hit a double in the 6th inning, and as he stood proudly on second base, he caught my eye in the stands and waved. I waved back, my heart full of love and pride. After the game, which they won, Tripp ran over to where I was waiting by the fence. Did you see that hit, Grandma? I saw everything, I told him, hugging him tight. You were magnificent. That evening, the whole family came to my house for a celebration dinner. It was the first time in 6 years that we'd all eaten together at my kitchen table. As we passed dishes and shared stories from the game, I was struck by how normal it felt and how precious normal could be. After dinner, while Drew and Trip did dishes, Roberto approached me quietly. "I know I'll never fully make up for what I did," she said, "but I want you to know that I think about it every day. I'm trying to be better." "We're all trying to be better," I replied. "That's all any of us can do." Later, as they were getting ready to leave, Trip hugged me goodbye and said, "I'm glad the truth came out, Grandma. I'm glad you fought for it." "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." After they left, I sat on my front porch in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic. These were the sounds of normal life, the life I'd almost lost to someone else's lie. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows and the sound of birds singing in the maple tree outside. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with the newspaper, enjoying the quiet morning routine I'd rebuilt. My phone rang and I saw Trip's number on the screen. "Good morning, Grandma. What are you doing today?" "Just enjoying a peaceful morning," I told him. "What about you?" "Well, I was thinking maybe I could come over after school and we could work on that birdhouse we started. I'd love that. And maybe we could make those sugar cookies with the colored frosting." I laughed. Maybe we could. After we hung up, I sat back in my chair and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years of carrying someone else's guilt and shame had nearly broken me, but it also taught me the value of truth and the strength I never knew I possessed. The money had been repaid, the relationships had been mended, and my place in my grandson's life had been restored. But more than that, I'd learned to trust myself again, to believe my own memories and perceptions, and to fight for what was right, even when it was difficult. As I finished my coffee and prepared to start my day, I felt grateful, not just for the truth that had set me free, but for the strength I'd found in pursuing it.